Anna Thompson's shoes echoed against the cold linoleum floor of Blackwood Hospital as she walked down the corridor. The building, a towering structure of stone and iron that had been in operation for over a century, loomed like a guardian of forgotten stories and hidden sorrows. The hospital had seen thousands of patients pass through its halls, but there were corners of it that were best left unexplored. It was her first night on the late shift, and the silence was more palpable than she had expected. During the day, Blackwood bustled with nurses, doctors, and the hum of equipment. But after the sun dipped behind the forested hills that surrounded the town, the hospital transformed. The fluorescent lights cast stark shadows, and the endless hallways seemed to stretch on into an abyss. As Anna made her way to the nurse's station, she felt a chill settle at the base of her spine. The old hospital was notorious for strange noises, creaks, and groans blamed on the building's age, but tonight, the silence was so thick it felt like it was pressing against her eardrums. She glanced at the old clock on the wall. It read 11:45 p.m., and she had hours to go before her shift ended. "Hey, newbie," called a voice, snapping Anna out of her thoughts. It was Lisa Martin, a veteran nurse with 15 years at Blackwood under her belt. Lisa was known for her sharp wit and no-nonsense attitude, but tonight, her usually bright eyes seemed dim. Anna smiled nervously. "Hey, Lisa, anything I should know before I start making my rounds?" Lisa leaned against the counter, her expression hardening. "Stay out of the West Wing after midnight," she said, her tone low. The West Wing housed patient rooms, but many of them were empty, used only during busy times. "Why?" Anna asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Lisa hesitated, glancing around as if to ensure no one else was listening. "Let's just say it's not worth the trouble. If you hear anything strange, ignore it. You'll thank me later." Before Anna could press for more details, Lisa straightened and walked away, her steps quick and deliberate. The hall fell silent once more, leaving Anna with only the soft hum of the fluorescent lights for company. She busied herself with checking patient charts and delivering medication, but Lisa's warning clung to her like a shadow. The minutes ticked by, and the quiet grew heavier, more stifling. As she approached room 203, she heard a faint noise, like a sigh coming from the hallway that led to the West Wing. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The sound came again, this time clearer. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving down the hall. Anna's hand tightened around the clipboard she was holding. The corridor leading to the West Wing was dim, the lights flickering as if struggling against some unseen force. With a deep breath, Anna took a step forward, peering down the hall. The air felt colder here, heavy with an unnatural stillness. The footsteps had stopped, but the silence that replaced them was even more unsettling. Her pulse quickened, and she told herself it was just her imagination, the product of exhaustion and nerves. She turned to continue her rounds, but the sound of a faint whisper stopped her in her tracks. "Help me." The voice was soft, barely more than a breath, but it sent a shiver racing down her spine. Anna spun around, but the hall was empty, the shadows deep and impenetrable. She stood there for a moment, heart pounding, before shaking her head and walking away, forcing herself not to glance back. The rest of Anna's shift passed uneventfully, but the whispers and the cold that had brushed against her in the West Wing refused to leave her mind. By the time dawn broke and the morning shift arrived, she was exhausted, her nerves frayed. as she slipped out of the hospital and into the crisp morning air. The sunlight felt almost unreal, too warm and bright after the long hours of darkness. The next night, Anna returned for her shift with a sense of apprehension she couldn't shake. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, sterile glow over the empty corridors. She pushed the memory of the whispered voice to the back of her mind and focused on her rounds. Lisa's warning echoed in her head, but Anna told herself that she wouldn't let an old building and her overactive imagination get the better of her. The first few hours were quiet. The patients were asleep, and the only sounds were the distant beeps of monitors and the soft rustle of sheets. It was almost peaceful until the clock struck midnight. As if on cue, the temperature in the room dropped. Anna's breath misted in the air as a shiver rolled down her spine. She rubbed her arms, trying to chase away the chill, when a noise reached her ears, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming against wood. It was coming from room 207. Anna's heart thudded in her chest as she stared at the closed door at the end of the corridor. Room 207 had been sealed for years. The paint was chipped, and a small "Do Not Enter" sign hung crookedly on the handle. She had heard the stories: patients who died alone, staff who claimed to hear voices or see figures at the edge of their vision. Lisa had once told her that room 207 was the epicenter of the strange occurrences that plagued the hospital. The tapping continued, insistent and almost mocking. Anna's curiosity warred with the cold knot of fear in her stomach. Taking a deep breath, she approached the door, the clipboard in her hand trembling slightly. "Hello," she called, her voice small in the silence. The tapping stopped. Anna's heart leaped into her throat as the silence stretched out, heavy and suffocating. She reached for the doorknob, her fingers brushing the cold metal, when a shadow shifted beneath the crack at the bottom of the door. She stepped back, her breath catching in her chest. It was unmistakably a shadow, moving, slow and deliberate, as if someone was pacing back and forth inside the room. Suddenly, a soft thump sounded from within, followed by a faint rustling, like sheets being pulled across a bed. Anna's instincts screamed at her to turn and run, but she stood frozen, unable to tear her eyes away from the door. The seconds dragged on, each heartbeat louder than the last, until a sudden knock on the door jolted her back into motion. "Anna, what are you doing here?" Lisa's voice cut through the silence, making Anna jump. She turned to see Lisa standing at the end of the hall, her face pale and eyes wide. "I heard something," Anna said, her voice barely above a whisper. From inside, Lisa's expression darkened, and she hurried over, grabbing Anna's arm and pulling her back. "I told you to stay away from this wing after midnight," she hissed, her voice sharp with urgency. "You don't know what you're dealing with." Before Anna could respond, the tapping resumed, louder and more frantic. The two nurses stared at the door as the tapping turned into pounding, the sound reverberating down the hall. Anna's blood ran cold when she heard it again, a whisper, just behind the door. "Help me!" Lisa's grip tightened on Anna's arm. "We need to go, now." The pounding stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. The two nurses backed away from room 207, their breaths shallow and fast. Lisa led Anna down the corridor and away from the West Wing, not stopping until they were at the nurses' station. "What's going on?" Anna demanded, her voice shaking. "What is in that room?" Lisa looked at her, eyes dark with a mix of fear and resignation. "It's not something that can be explained easily," she said. Room 207 was the last room of a boy named Timothy. He died here during the plague years, abandoned by his family. Some say he still waits for someone to answer him. Anna's mouth went dry. The whisper, the tapping, it all made sense now, but it also made her feel sick. "Why does he stay?" she asked. Lisa's gaze drifted to the West Wing, her expression haunted. "Because he never got to say goodbye. And he won't rest until he does." Anna's next few shifts were anything but normal. The eerie tapping, the whispers, and Lisa's warning had set a fire in her mind that she couldn't extinguish. She found herself constantly glancing down the corridor that led to room 207, half expecting to see a shadow moving or hear a whisper echoing her name. On her third consecutive night shift, Anna's resolve hardened. She needed to know more about Timothy, about what had happened in room 207. The curiosity gnawed at her, pushing aside her fear. Lisa's stories had only deepened her need for answers. As the hospital settled into its midnight hush, Anna made her way to the records room. It was tucked away behind the main administration office, a place where few ventured. The room smelled of old paper and dust, and the rows of metal filing cabinets stood like sentinels guarding the past. Anna switched on her flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. She traced her fingers over the cabinet labels, searching for patient records from the early 1900s. Finally, she found what she was looking for: a worn drawer labeled 1900 to 1910. She pulled it open, the metallic screech echoing in the silence. Her heart thudded as she flipped through the yellowed files. The names and details felt heavy, each one a life marked by suffering. After several minutes, she found it. Timothy Harris, age 8, admitted 1902. Anna scanned the file, her breath catching as she read the final notes. Timothy had been brought in during the outbreak of a deadly flu, abandoned by his family who had fled the town. The doctors had done what they could, but Timothy's condition had deteriorated rapidly. The last entry, written in a scrawled, hurried hand, read, "Patient passed on the evening of November 13th. Last words. Will they ever come back for me?" Anna's chest tightened. The boy had died, waiting for people who never returned. She imagined him, scared and alone, in the cold room that had now become the epicenter of so many ghost stories. As she closed the file, she noticed something else tucked between the pages: small, folded note. She pulled it out carefully and unfolded it. The paper was fragile, but the handwriting was clear. "If anyone finds this, please tell them I'm sorry. I just want them to come back. I didn't mean to be sick." Tears welled in Anna's eyes. Timothy's note wasn't just a plaid, was an apology from a child who thought he was to blame for being abandoned. She clutched the note, the weight of its words pressing on her chest. A sudden chill swept through the records room, making her shiver. The faint sound of footsteps echoed from the corridor outside, slow and deliberate. Anna's pulse quickened. She turned off her flashlight and held her breath, listening. The footsteps stopped at the doorway, and for a moment, the silence was deafening. Then, a whisper, clear and close, broke the quiet. "Why did they leave?" Anna's hand flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp. The voice was small, trembling, filled with the kind of sadness that lodged deep in her bones. She forced herself to look toward the door, but the beam of light from the hallway cast only shadows that shifted and flickered like living things. "Timothy," she whispered, her voice shaking. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. She waited, heart pounding, but no response came. The footsteps retreated, fading into the distance until all that was left was the hum of the air conditioning and the soft rustle of papers. Anna's hands trembled as she refolded the note and slipped it into her pocket. She knew she couldn't ignore this any longer. The boy's spirit was trapped, tethered to a place where his last moments had been filled with fear and longing. If there was a way to help him find peace, she had to try. She left the records room, her resolve firm. As she walked back to the nurse's station, Lisa was there, her expression clouded with worry. "You shouldn't be digging into this," Lisa said, her voice low but firm. "Some things are better left alone." Anna met her gaze, the note burning in her pocket. "He's just a child, Lisa. A scared, lonely child. How can we ignore that?" Lisa's face softened, the hardness in her eyes giving way to something like guilt. "Because the last time someone tried to help him, it didn't end well," she said. "Do you know about Dr. Mercer?" Anna shook her head. "Dr. Mercer was a young doctor, just like you're a new nurse," Lisa continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "He found out about Timothy, tried to find a way to bring him peace. He spent nights in the West Wing, praying, leaving gifts, talking to the air. One night, he disappeared. They found his shoes and his medical coat in room 207, but he was gone. No trace, just whispers." The cold settled deep in Anna's bones, but it didn't quell her determination. "Maybe he was close to helping him," she said, her voice firm. "Maybe that's why Timothy is reaching out again. And this time, I won't let him wait alone." Lisa looked at her, fear and something like hope mingling in her expression. "Just be careful," she said finally. "This place holds on to its secrets, and it doesn't like to let go." The hospital's silence weighed heavily on Anna as she moved down the corridor leading to the West Wing. The faint glow from the emergency exit signs cast eerie shadows that seemed to shift as she passed. In her pocket, Timothy's note felt like an anchor, grounding her against the current of fear that threatened to sweep her away. Lisa's warning echoed in her mind, but she couldn't let it stop her. If Timothy had reached out to her, it was because he needed help. Room 207 loomed at the end of the hall, its door slightly ajar. A shiver ran down her spine as she approached. The air was colder here, heavy with a presence that defied explanation. She pushed the door open, the creak cutting through the silence like a knife. The room was as she had imagined, dark and untouched by time. The bed in the center was covered in a thin layer of dust, the sheets pulled back as if someone had just climbed out of it. The small table next to the bed held an old glass lamp, its shade frayed at the edges. Shadows danced along the walls, shifting with an almost sentient quality. Anna took a step inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. She swallowed, her throat dry. "Timothy," she called softly, her voice quivering. The silence that followed was suffocating. She took another step and felt a sudden rush of cold air sweep past her, ruffling her hair and sending a chill down her neck. Why did they leave? The whisper was so close that Anna spun around, her breath caught in her chest. The room was empty. but she could feel the presence timid and sad, as if hiding in the corners. "They were afraid, Timothy," she said, her voice shaking but steady. "But it wasn't your fault." For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. The shadows on the walls shifted, and the air grew thick with a tension that made Anna's skin prickle. A faint rustling sound came from the corner, and she turned, heart pounding. There, standing by the window, was a small figure. The boy was dressed in a simple hospital gown, his dark hair disheveled, and his eyes wide with a sadness that was almost tangible. He stared at her, unmoving, as if afraid she would vanish like everyone else had. Anna's breath hitched as she met his gaze. He looked so real, so fragile. "Timothy," she whispered, taking a cautious step forward. "I found your note." His eyes flickered to her pocket, and a ghost of a smile passed over his pale lips. "They left me," he said, the words more of a sigh than a statement. Anna nodded, tears stinging her eyes. "I know, but they didn't mean to. They were scared, and they didn't understand." Timothy's gaze dropped to the floor, and for a moment, the room was so silent that Anna could hear the rapid beating of her heart. Then he looked up again, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Can they know now?" he asked, his voice trembling. Anna stepped forward, pulling the note from her pocket and placing it gently on the dusty table beside the bed. "Yes, Timothy, they'll know." The temperature in the room shifted, the oppressive chill lifting as warmth spread through the air. The shadows that had loomed so menacingly seemed to recede, fading into the corners. Timothy's form grew fainter, his outline shimmering as if made of mist. "Thank you," he whispered, his eyes softening with relief. Before Anna could say another word, he was gone, dissolving into the light that now streamed through the cracked window. The room was still, but the silence felt different, peaceful, like the end of a long storm. Anna stood there, tears running down her face, a weight lifting from her chest. The whispers were gone, and the air was no longer suffocating. For the first time, room 207 felt like any other room in the hospital, touched by light and memory, but free from the heavy grip of sorrow. A soft knock at the door made her turn. Lisa stood there, her eyes wide with disbelief as she looked past Anna and into the room. "It's over, isn't it?" Lisa asked, her voice barely a whisper. Anna nodded, a smile breaking through the tears. "Yes, he's at peace now." Lisa stepped into the room, the tension in her shoulders easing. "You did it," she said, her expression softening. "You gave him what he needed." Anna glanced at the note on the table, the paper no longer feeling heavy with sorrow, but light with hope. "No," she said, turning back to Lisa. "He gave it to us." Word of the sudden change in the West Wing spread among the hospital staff within days. The rumors of Room 27's haunting faded into whispers of hope. A story that made its way into the quiet conversations of nurses on their breaks and orderlies moving through the hallways. But for Anna, the story wasn't over. She couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper lingered in Blackwood Hospital's walls, something that Timothy's release had only just begun to uncover. A week after that night, Anna sat in the break room, sipping a cup of lukewarm coffee. Lisa sat across from her, the two sharing a silence that had become familiar yet comfortable. The atmosphere was lighter, but the mystery surrounding Timothy's life and the strange vanishing of Dr. Mercer still gnawed at Anna Have you ever wondered what happened to Dr. Mercer? Anna asked, breaking the silence. Lisa sighed, setting her mug down. Of course I have. Everyone has. But the truth is, nobody really knows. The administration covered it up, said he must have left on his own accord. But we all knew better. Anna leaned forward, her brows furrowing. I think whatever happened to him is connected to Timothy's story. I need to find out why. Lisa's eyes widened slightly. Anna, you already did what nobody else could. You helped Timothy. Isn't that enough? Anna hesitated, the image of the boy's sad, hopeful eyes flashing through her mind. It should be, she said softly, but I can't shake the feeling that there's more. Timothy was just the beginning. That evening, after most of the staff had gone home and the hospital had sunk into its familiar nighttime quiet, Anna returned to the records room. The scent of old paper and dust seemed sharper this time, as if the room itself was holding its breath. She sifted through the files until she found a folder marked with a simple, handwritten label. Dr. Jonathan Mercer. The file was thin, almost suspiciously so. It contained routine notes and reports, but nothing that hinted at his disappearance. Frustrated, Anna flipped through the last few pages, until something fell out a small, folded sheet of paper, brittle with age. She opened it carefully and found a hurried scrawl. They know I'm close. The shadows grow stronger, hungrier. Timothy isn't the only one. A chill ran down her spine as she read the last line. The shadows, the same dark presence she had felt in room 207. But what did Dr. Mercer mean by hungrier? And who were they? The silence of the records room was broken by a sudden, soft, rhythmic tapping. Anna's breath caught in her throat as she turned toward the source. It came from the hallway, from the direction of the west wing. Clutching the paper, she stepped out of the records room and into the dark corridor. The tapping continued, drawing her toward room 207. The door was open, the room dimly lit by the emergency lights in the hallway. She stepped inside, the cold air biting at her skin. "Who's there?" she called, her voice wavering. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, pressing against her ears. Then, from the corner of the room, a shadow shifted. It moved slowly, separating itself from the darkness, until it stood in the faint light. It was taller than Timothy, its limbs impossibly thin, and its eyes glowed a dull red hue. Anna's heart pounded as she took a step back. The shadow moved forward, its outline shifting like smoke. It spoke, its voice low and hollow, reverberating in the small room. "You shouldn't have opened the past." The air grew colder, so cold that Anna could see her breath. The shadow's presence was suffocating, filling the room with an ancient dread. She tried to move, to run, but her feet felt rooted to the floor. Timothy was not the only one trapped here. The voice continued, shifting like a breeze. There are others, bound by a darkness that feeds on the forgotten, the abandoned. Anna's pulse thundered in her ears as she remembered Dr. Mercer's note. The shadows grow stronger, hungrier. "Who are you?" she managed, her voice barely a whisper. The shadow didn't answer. Instead, it moved closer, its red eyes narrowing. It raised an arm, fingers like claws stretching out toward her. The cold intensified, seeping into her bones, and the room seemed to spin. Just as her vision started to blur, she heard a voice, distant and familiar. "Anna," the spell broke, and she stumbled backward. Lisa stood in the doorway, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. The shadow receded, melting into the corners until it was gone. The cold dissipated, leaving the room in a stunned silence. Anna gasped for air, her hands trembling as she turned to Lisa. "What was that?" Lisa whispered, her voice breaking. Anna held up the paper, her eyes still wide with shock. Dr. Mercer knew about them. He knew Timothy wasn't the only one. Lisa's gaze flicked to the shadowy corners of the room, then back to Anna. "We need to find out how to end this," she said, determination hardening her voice. "Before they take someone else." The morning came with little relief. The hospital hummed back to life, its sterile halls filled with the sounds of footsteps and quiet conversations. But the events of the previous night left an unspoken tension hanging in the air. Anna and Lisa met in the staff lounge, away from prying eyes and curious ears. "We need to go deeper," Anna said, her voice steady despite the unease that gnawed at her. She unfolded the note from Dr. Mercer, smoothing out the fragile paper on the table between them. The ink was smudged in places, as if written with a shaky hand. "They know I'm close." The shadows grow stronger, hungrier. He knew there was more than just Timothy. Lisa's eyes darkened as she nodded. "I've heard whispers over the years, not just from patients or staff, but from the older nurses who retired before their time. The ones who used to talk about the silent ones, spirits bound to this place. But no one wanted to believe it. They said it was just the grief of working here too long, that it made people see things." Anna took a deep breath. "We need to find out what Dr. Mercer was doing before he disappeared. If he was trying to help Timothy, maybe he left behind more notes, more clues." Lisa glanced around the empty lounge, then leaned in closer. "There's one place we haven't checked. The old basement archives. The administration shut it down decades ago, claiming it was unsafe, but some of the older patient files are still there. If Mercer was keeping any hidden records, they'd be in that mess." Anna felt her pulse quicken. The basement was a part of the hospital she had avoided, a place that staff spoke of in whispers or avoided mentioning altogether. It was where the oldest records and unused medical equipment were stored. But it was also known for its unsettling atmospherical drafts, flickering lights, and the sensation of being watched. "We'll go tonight," Anna said, her resolve hardening. "We'll find whatever it is he was trying to uncover." When midnight arrived, the hospital settled into its quiet, watchful stillness. Lisa and Anna exchanged uneasy glances as they made their way to the basement door at the end of a dimly lit hallway. The air felt colder here, carrying a stale, metallic scent that made Anna's skin prickle. Lisa produced a small set of keys and unlocked the heavy door. It swung open with a creak that echoed down the hall, and they stepped inside, the beam of their flashlights casting long shadows across the dusty, cluttered space. Rows of metal shelves lined the basement, filled with old files, broken machines, and forgotten medical supplies. The air was damp, and their footsteps echoed, amplifying the silence around them. "Over here," Lisa whispered, pointing to a corner where older patient files were stacked in uneven piles. Anna set down her flashlight and started sorting through the papers. Many were mundanal patient records, treatment logs, notes from doctors long retired. But as she moved aside a stack of dusty folders, something caught her eye. A leather-bound journal, small and worn, tucked between two rusted medical trays. She opened it carefully, recognizing the handwriting immediately. Dr. Mercer's scrawl was hurried, as if he had written each word with urgency. Timothy is not alone. The whispers come from more than one voice. There is an old darkness here, something that has fed on loneliness and fear for decades. The shadows are not spirits, but remnants of suffering, bound to this place. They grow stronger with each forgotten soul. I have to find a way to stop it before they take me to... Anna's hands trembled as she read the words aloud. Lisa's face paled, her eyes wide with realization. They feed on suffering, Lisa repeated, her voice hollow. Every patient that died alone, every soul that was abandoned in these halls. A sudden noise made them both freeze, a soft, scraping sound, like metal against stone. The beam of Anna's flashlight flickered as she turned it toward the source. One of the metal trays had shifted, though neither of them had touched it. The scraping continued, louder and more deliberate, as if something unseen was dragging it across the floor. Anna, Lisa whispered, taking a step back. But before they could react, the lights in the basement sputtered and died, plunging them into darkness. The air grew colder, biting at their skin, as an oppressive silence settled over the room. The shadows seemed to shift and move, wrapping around them like tendrils. A low, hollow voice whispered from somewhere in the darkness. A chorus of sounds overlapping in a language neither of them could understand. Anna gripped the journal tighter, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The darkness felt alive, pressing against her, suffocating. She reached out blindly and felt Lisa's hand, cold and trembling, grasp hers. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, until a single voice cut through the cacophony. You are not welcome. A figure materialized from the shadows, taller and more defined than the one Anna had seen in room 207. Its eyes glowed a deep crimson, and its form seemed to ripple and shift as if made from smoke and ash. It stepped forward, raising an arm that ended in fingers, long and sharp like knives. Anna's mind raced, the words from Dr. Mercer's journal flashing through her mind. The shadows feed on suffering. Dr. Mercer was trying to help you, she said, her voice quivering but firm. We're here to finish what he started. We're not your enemies. The figure paused, its head tilting, as if considering her words. The oppressive weight in the room lifted slightly, enough for Anna to take a breath. But the momentary reprieve was shattered by a guttural growl that reverberated through the room. You cannot free what has been bound for eternity, the voice said, deeper and angrier now. Lisa squeezed Anna's hand, her voice barely a whisper. We need to get out of here now. Before Anna could respond, the shadows surged forward, enveloping them in cold darkness. She felt herself being pulled, as if the ground had turned to quicksand. The whispers turned into screams, filling her ears until all she could do was close her eyes and hold on. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the darkness receded. The basement was silent once more, and Anna found herself on the floor, the journal still clutched tightly in her hands. Lisa was beside her, pale and shaken, but alive. The crimson-eyed shadow was gone, but its warning lingered in the air like a bitter taste. Anna met Lisa's gaze, her voice hoarse as she spoke. "We need to find out how to break this curse. Whatever Dr. Mercer was trying to do, it's the only way." Lisa nodded, determination replacing the fear in her eyes. "And we need to do it before the shadows take more than just our peace." Anna and Lisa sat in the break room the next morning, the events of the previous night hanging over them like a storm cloud. The leather journal lay between them on the table, its pages filled with Dr. Mercer's frantic notes. They hadn't slept, and the fatigue showed in their drawn faces and bloodshot eyes, but neither was willing to give up. Whatever dark force haunted Blackwood Hospital had to be confronted. Anna flipped through the journal again, her fingers tracing the uneven lines of Dr. Mercer's writing. Amid the scribbled entries, one passage caught her eye. The origin lies not just in the forgotten patients, but in the land itself. The hospital was built on the site of an old settlement, a place where the desperate sought refuge. But the suffering became something more, something that attached itself to the ground. The builders knew, and they hid it, sealing the truth beneath brick and stone. Lisa leaned in, her brow furrowed. "A settlement? What could he mean?" Anna exhaled slowly. "If this is true, then the hospital's history goes back further than we thought. It's not just about Timothy or the patients. It's about something older, something buried." They exchanged a glance of mutual understanding. The hospital archives had already given them what they could, so if they wanted answers, they needed to look beyond its walls. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in hues of deep purple and orange, Anna and Lisa drove into town to visit the Blackwood Historical Society. The old stone building was nestled among shops and cafes, its ivy-clad facade almost forgotten by those who passed by. Mrs. Reynolds, the curator, greeted them at the door. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. But her expression softened when she saw their tired, determined faces. "How can I help you, ladies?" she asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. "We need to know about the history of Blackwood Hospital," Anna said. "Specifically, the land it was built on." Mrs. Reynolds's smile faltered. She hesitated, her eyes darting to the shelves, lined with dusty books and faded photographs. "That's an old story, one most people prefer to forget," she said finally. "But I suppose it's time someone knew the truth." She led them to a corner of the room where an old map was framed on the wall. It was yellowed with age, the ink smudged and worn. Mrs. Reynolds pointed to an area marked Hollow Settlement. "Before the hospital was built, there was a small settlement here," she said. "It was founded by a group of families fleeing a famine, hoping to start anew. But the land was unforgiving, and their hope soon turned to despair. They called it hollow because it felt as if something had been drained from the very earth." Anna's stomach tightened as she listened. What happened to them? Mrs. Reynolds's eyes darkened. They were never seen again. All that remained were whispers of rituals, desperate attempts to survive by calling on forces they didn't understand. The town was abandoned, and the ground was said to be cursed. When the hospital was built years later, the stories were buried along with it. Lisa's breath caught. So the shadows, the spirits, they're remnants of that settlement's suffering. Mrs. Reynolds nodded solemnly. The land remembers, even if we choose to forget. Anna's mind raced with the implications. The shadows weren't just lost souls. They were manifestations of pain and fear that had taken root in the land itself. And Dr. Mercer had realized this too late. "Thank you, Mrs. Reynolds," Anna said, her voice quiet but resolute. "We need to find a way to confront this." The old woman's eyes softened with something like pity. "Be careful," she said. "The past does not let go easily." Back at the hospital, Anna and Lisa pored over the journal and the information they had gathered. Dr. Mercer had hinted at an old ritual meant to cleanse the land. A ceremony that had been attempted by the settlement's leaders, but had failed when their desperation turned to fear. The only way to complete it was to face the shadows directly, to acknowledge the pain and release it. Anna felt a shiver run through her. The prospect of facing the entity that had nearly consumed them in the basement was terrifying. But she knew they had no choice. "We'll need to gather everything we can," she said. "Candles, symbols of peace, whatever we can find that might help." Lisa nodded, her jaw set in determination. "We'll need to do it tonight, before it grows stronger." As midnight approached, they prepared a small, makeshift altar in room 207. The air felt thick, almost electric, as if the hospital itself was holding its breath. They lit the candles, their flames flickering in the draft that seemed to come from nowhere. Anna placed Timothy's note on the table, the crumpled paper smoothed out so that the boy's last words were visible. The journal lay open beside it, the passage about the ritual marked for reference. They stood together, the room dimly lit by the soft, trembling glow of the candles. Lisa began to recite the words Dr. Mercer had scribbled in his notes. A mix of old prayers and invocations meant to acknowledge the forgotten and offer them peace. Anna's heart pounded as the temperature dropped and the familiar sense of suffocating cold wrapped around her. The shadows in the corners of the room began to move, shifting and coiling like snakes. The crimson-eyed figure appeared, more defined than ever, its form stretching up toward the ceiling. Its voice cut through the silence, deep and resonant. "You dare to defy us." Anna took a step forward, forcing herself to meet its gaze. "We're here to end this," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "Not to defy you, but to set you free." The shadows hissed and swirled, the room vibrating with their anger. The candles flickered wildly, some sputtering out, plunging parts of the room into darkness. Lisa continued to chant, her voice steady, even as the shadows surged toward them, reaching with claw-like tendrils. Anna felt the cold seep into her bones, a paralyzing chill that threatened to overwhelm her. But then she remembered Timothy's face, the hope in his eyes as he had faded into the light. She clenched her fists, drawing strength from that memory. "We know your pain," Anna said, her voice stronger now. "We're not here to banish you. We're here to remember, to end the suffering." For a moment, the room was silent, the shadows stilled, and the crimson eyes narrowed, as if considering her words. Then, slowly, the air shifted. The oppressive weight began to lift, replaced by a strange warmth. The shadows receded, their shapes softening and fading into the corners until only the figure with the red eyes remained. Its form shimmered, the eyes losing their sharpness, turning almost human. The voice that followed was softer, filled with a sadness that resonated through the room. "Remember us. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, the figure dissolved, leaving only the glow of the candles and the faint scent of smoke. The silence that followed was different, peaceful, as if a great burden had finally been lifted. Lisa exhaled, a smile breaking across her face despite the tears in her eyes. "It's over," she whispered. Anna nodded, tears streaming down her face. The pain and fear that had haunted Blackwood Hospital for so long had been acknowledged, released into the light. The land remembered, but now so did they. In the days that followed, the hospital felt lighter, as if a veil had been lifted. Staff and patients alike spoke of better sleep, of dreams filled not with shadows, but with warmth and light. Room 207, once a place of fear, became a quiet sanctuary, where Timothy's note and Dr. Mercer's journal were kept as reminders of what had been overcome. Anna and Lisa continued their work, bonded by the experience that had nearly broken them, but had ultimately strengthened their resolve. And though the hospital still whispered with the echoes of the past, it was no longer a place of fear, but one of remembrance. They had faced the darkness, and in doing so, had given it peace.